Hello, my name's Virginia Holman. I am with Island Wildlife Cape Fear region. We're the lower Cape Fear chapter of the North Carolina Wildlife Federation. And we are just delighted to have author Georgann Eubanks with us today. She'll be speaking about her new book, just out from the University of North Carolina Press, titled Saving the Wild South, The Fight for Native Plants on the Brink of Extinction. And it includes some lovely photographs by Donna Campbell. Georgann was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, and graduated from Duke University with a degree in public policy studies. Georgann's books include 2018's popular The Month of Their Ripening, North Carolina Heritage Foods Through the Year, as well as the North Carolina Literary Trails series of guidebooks commissioned by the North Carolina Arts Council. Georgann is also an accomplished editor and teacher, and she directs the Table Rock Writers Workshop, which is held annually in the Blue Ridge Mountains. She and Donna Campbell also run Minnow Media and have produced public television documentaries focusing on arts, religion, social justice, and the changing demographics of North Carolina and the nation. She divides her time between Carrboro, North Carolina, and Little Switzerland, North Carolina. Please welcome Georgann Eubanks. Thank you, Georgann.
Thanks, Virginia. I'm going to see if I can make this screen share work. This
Okay.
is always sort of a weird thing to be presenting when the audience is quiet. Let's see, it says I'm screen sharing. Now I can't remember what to do, of course. Can you all see this, Virginia?
I can see your notes. I can see your entire.
Okay, so now I hit play. How's that?
That looks fantastic.
Okay, great. So I'm gonna back up though here. Let's see. And go to the first slide. Okay. And this menu is not showing for you all, right? You're not dealing with the menu. Okay.
It looks great. I see
Okay.
you and the quote.
Okay, perfect. So this quote from George Eliot is epigram at the beginning of the book. And it's, I believe, when we're children that we can be most captivated by nature. So part of my desire in writing this book was to encourage parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles to pay attention to the coming generations and give them what I learned as a child, which is that the outdoors is very important and a wonderful place to spend time, and that it is fragile and ephemeral and also reliable. The changing of the seasons is a wonderful thing and easy to take for granted if we're not paying attention. Saving the Wild South, again, I'm not a botanist, but I followed my curiosity about our native plant treasures in 6 states of the South. I decided to look more broadly than North Carolina, which I'd done in my previous books. And part of my interest to reach beyond North Carolina was just to take stock of the incredible biodiversity that we have as a region. And because I grew up in Georgia and my father's people were from Alabama, and I spent summers in South Carolina and Tennessee in the mountains and Florida as a kid going to the beaches, I wanted to look broadly at the treasures we have and how they define us as a culture, how plants are a part of our identity, and to drive home the point that when we lose a species, we lose part of who we are and the places that we know. My book on North Carolina heritage foods included 12 foods that are important to the culture of North Carolina. And there were a couple that grabbed my attention. Ramps, which grow in the mountains of North Carolina and have been eaten by the Cherokee people for 3,000 years, are suddenly being dug up wholesale by the roots by folks who can sell them to chefs across the country who are now using ramps in recipes. And so ramps are somewhat endangered. Likewise, our oysters at the coast have been subjected, as you all I'm sure know, to stormwater runoff and pollution and hurricane damage. And so our wild caught oysters are minimized now, and people are cultivating oysters, which is good news. But we need to pay attention to those oyster beds that right now really do not produce healthful oysters. So that's what got me on this path to thinking about endangered plants. This map shows the distribution of the botanical hotspots that we visited for the book. And again, we set out on this journey not knowing very much about our subject matter and meeting people along the way who could teach us about these species and show us the work that they were doing. So this is a book about the story, the history of plants and botanists in the region, and also the people who are working now to make a difference and to save these species and to preserve their seeds and their presence in natural habitat. Some of the species in the book, there are 12, again, 12 chapters. Some are federally endangered. Others are just increasingly rare, but I included them because they had a good story to tell. And for me as a writer, the story is very important. And there are some plants that, while they may not be in danger of being snuffed out immediately, they are habitat for other plants and animals that are endangered. One thing that is important to recognize is that flowering plants come in at about 270,000 species that are known, and there are another 80,000 species that are awaiting discovery, according to E.O. Wilson from Alabama. So scientists working on biodiversity are in a race to find as many of the surviving species as possible in each area before they vanish or overlooked and are never known, which was, I always thought we knew everything already in science. What do I know? There's also, and some of you have probably heard the term plant blindness, that was coined by two botanists from the American South. And what these folks said was that most people in developed nations tend to see plants as merely a green, blurry backdrop for the animals and human-made objects that populate their visual field. We are not trained to look hard and to distinguish among plants in a natural scene. And it takes some practice and work, as I'm sure many of you know. In 2006, these Southern researchers surveyed high school students at graduation, and they found that 77% of those questioned had never grown a plant by themselves, and another 10% had never picked fruit from a tree, and they couldn't remember any children's story that featured a plant. Oops, I think I skipped one there. There's also a human tendency just to prefer animals over plants, and when the Endangered Species Act was created in the late 1960s, it only protected animals. It took nearly a decade to add plants and trees, some 3,000 endangered plants. So ongoing plant blindness has led to a decline in funding for plant conservation and for the study of botany as compared to animal-related studies. So sadly, academic departments of botany and horticulture are currently in decline in many universities, or they're being merged into other departments, and not just in the United States. It's a global concern. But today I'm going to talk about carnivorous plants, and I thought that would be kind of a good idea given your location and the fact that you all have plants that occur nowhere else on Earth around Wilmington. And carnivorous plants tend to be an exception to the plant blindness theory. Human curiosity and enthusiasm about carnivorous plants has been perpetuated over generations. Charles Darwin wrote a definitive book on them in 1875. And earlier than that, William Bartram encountered pitcher plants on a tramp through the South with his father in the 1700s. And in the introduction to his classic book, Bartram's Travels, which is a good read, he said, "Shall we analyze these beautiful plants since they seem cheerfully to invite us? How greatly the flowers of the yellow Sarracenia represent a silken canopy." So today I'm going to talk about the Alabama canebrake pitcher plant and the green pitcher plant. This is the Alabama plant, and I want to read you just a tiny bit from chapter 3 in the book about how pitcher plants operate. The North American pitcher plant is an adaptive genius and one of the most oddly alluring of all flora. In only 3 million years, a very short time in plant evolution, these charismatic perennials have adapted to poor acidic soils by becoming carnivorous. Dressed in garish colors with dramatic trumpet-shaped leaves faced with contrasting veins, pitcher plants entice unsuspecting insects to serve as their supper. The hood that hovers over each trumpet secretes an irresistible nectar, seducing crawling and flying insects to explore the lip of the pitcher and the underside of the hood. Visiting ants and other insects soon find themselves trapped. The upper throat of the trumpet is wickedly slick. If a visitor slips and grabs at the walls deeper inside, the stiff, downward sloping hairs make it nearly impossible to crawl back out. Eventually, the weary insect falls into a well of toxins at the bottom of the pitcher and dissolves into a happy meal of nitrogen and phosphorus for the plant. Such extraordinary attributes have also made pitcher plants irresistible to human collectors and poachers. The Alabama canebrake pitcher plant was discovered and named in 1974 by a husband and wife team of botanists from Michigan who were visiting in Alabama. And some of the plants they found were growing on land owned by paper companies. And of course, you know, Alabama has been historically a big paper and pulpwood producer. Once they discovered the plants, the species was listed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as endangered. The green pitcher plant on the right there will follow in my discussion of the canebrake. But this is an important fact. Environmental crimes have become the 4th largest criminal enterprise in the world, following drug smuggling, counterfeiting, and human trafficking. So conservation is an uphill battle. This is Chuck Byrd of the Alabama Nature Conservancy, who we met at a secret site, which we found using the compass points that Chuck emailed us. In the middle of nowhere, we drove and found this driveway and waited for him to come. It was a little bit unnerving. We had private property on either side of us and this gate that was locked, and we were waiting and hoping that we had the right place. He was our guide to see blooming canebrake pitcher plants in Bibb County, Alabama, which is one of only 6 sites in the state, all small. The property that we were on was commercially planted in timber, Chuck said, and the Nature Conservancy bought it through the land acquisition program called Forever Wild Alabama, which I'll talk about in a little bit. They did a commercial harvest, marking plants in no-take areas, and then took out lots of trees to open up the forest to sunlight. And that was critical for the habitat to recur that was favorable to the pitcher plants. Trees suck up the moisture and other plants can't grow when pines are commercially planted so close together as they once were in this site. And this is sort of a scene that could be Eastern North Carolina. For the canebrake pitcher plants, destruction generally came in the conversion of pine savannas to pine plantations. And Bibb County and the counties around it are just full still of these densely planted forests that are cultivated for paper and pulpwood. And on our way to the secret site, we passed more than a few trucks carrying these enormous trees to market, having been harvested. We hiked into the gated preserve, and I said to Chuck, gosh, these pines look really young to me. They have such skinny trunks. You can see them behind him there. And he said, the soils here, you have to remember, are nutrient poor. Some of these trees might be 100 years old, but they're not well fed. Now, the Alabama canebrake pitcher plant, unlike pitcher plants that thrive in a bog like the ones that Virginia had behind her this morning, these grow on a limestone seepage slope in a pretty narrow window. Eventually their color changes, they die back, but then they come back in late winter, which is not a very hard winter in this spot. If you look at Chuck's knees, you can see the red blooms to the right. So they're pretty short plants. The band of specimens that we saw was maybe 100 yards long by 20 yards wide. And Chuck said I could stomp all over them if I didn't know how to look for them. And I thought, yep, plant blindness. I would have missed them if Chuck hadn't pointed them out. They were nestled in almost a grove of wild blueberries. And he pointed out that the poachers love that perky hood that keeps the rain out and entices the insects in. People just have a love for these strange plants and can't resist stealing them. These are the blooms, and you can see the seeds in the cup underneath the bloom. The Native American people have long understood the pharmacological uses of carnivorous plants. They used extractions from pitcher plant leaves to treat diabetes, and extracts from sundews, another carnivorous plant that we saw living under these pitcher plants. They used those to treat respiratory ailments, including tuberculosis. As early as the mid-1500s, Native Americans, we found out, were doing that. The roots of yellow pitcher plants were also used in the treatment of indigestion and headaches and were studied at length by a South Carolina botanist in the 1800s. Researchers now are looking at pitcher plants, at the fluids that they use to trap and digest insects, and they're developing biomimetic materials that may lead to new drug delivery systems, self-lubricating machines, and new types of agricultural drip education systems, irrigation systems, according to a fellow at Harvard. So these possible applications are a strong argument for preserving the plants in the wild, because the non-native plantings of carnivorous plants can become invasive or disturb the genetic identity of their neighbors and then mess up what makes the species unique. Yet, if they're on the federal endangered list and are growing in on public land, they cannot be disturbed or used for testing. So it's a kind of, the government regulations are a two-sided sword. The Nature Conservancy in Alabama has a staff of 20 covering the entire state. And Chuck was just at the end of fire season, meaning that he was going out and working with the Sierra Club and the Audubon Society with prescribed fires to restore the understory and help, in specifically green pitcher plants, come back. Chuck said, I tell people I'm a plant conservationist, but I set them on fire and I mow them down. And to prepare for a burn, they use leaf blowers very gently to create fire breaks, but try not to make room for invasives to get in. And the guys that burn, guys and women actually that I met who do these burns, are very keen on it. So 6 months after that May day that we were out in the woods with Chuck Byrd, someone came to this conservation site and took every single seed from the population of canebrake pitcher plants that we saw. They also took another population nearby and stripped them of seed, a population that had been cultivated by the Atlanta Botanical Garden in Alabama. And then sometime later, the green pitcher plant sites in northern Alabama had their seeds removed. So, and then finally some seeds went missing in North Carolina from the extremely rare mountain sweet pitcher plant. But when I told this story to Emily Coffey, who's the director of research at Atlanta Botanical Garden, she kind of smiled and said, well, at least they didn't rip up the plants. The plants are still there and they'll come back, and, you know, they didn't destroy them. So it was somebody who knew what they were doing. You can see the seeds there in that little bulb. The plants reproduce both by roots and shoots or rhizomes, and they also drop the seeds. And the seeds are about the size of a poppy. So if the ground cover is too thick, the tiny seeds have a hard time gaining purchase in the soil to sprout. So the burning really helps with that. We went to the Birmingham Botanical Garden, and they showcase all the native treasures of Alabama, including pitcher plants and other wildflowers. But it's important to note that in the 1990s, I mean, fairly recently, in Bibb County alone, which is where we were looking at those pitcher plants, 61 species of rare plants were discovered in what had been an iron smelting operation during the Civil War. And as Alabama was developing parks and working on creating historic sites, they found these plants, and 8 of them were species previously unknown. So that's really cool, but it gives us also a pause in thinking about what are we destroying that we don't even know we're destroying. So Venus flytraps, Wilmington's claim to fame and the state plant of North Carolina, or state carnivorous plant. I can't remember, the legislature declared it in the 90s, I think. The Venus flytraps were for sale at the Birmingham Botanical Garden. And it was sort of to help defray the temptation of folks of trying to steal them. Not that, I mean, pitcher plants were for sale as well. And of course, as you all well know, the carnivorous plants remaining in habitat, especially in Brunswick County, in the Green Swamp, or in the Holly, what is it called? Holly something area. Those are in remote and economically depressed areas with poor soil that's unsuited to crops. And so people are tempted to gather up these expressions of nature and to sell them to dealers who offer high prices. But North Carolina, as you probably know, has some very strict penalties on Venus flytraps in particular. And my editor really liked this chapter because it had crime involved, and she said that'll be really popular, but I think it's kind of sad. David Shaddix was a fellow we met in Sterrett, Alabama, who was raising pitcher plants, does a good wholesale business south of Birmingham, and he grows and sells pitchers wholesale, also again to try to lessen the temptation among those who want to own them. This is Noah Yawn, who was one of the greatest, most inspiring young people that I met on my journeys for this book. And he fell in love with pitcher plants when he was 14, and he pursued his interest through high school. He cultivated them at home, and he was a first-generation college student from a low-income family, but he did really well in his studies at Auburn. And he's now working at the Auburn Arboretum and practicing conservation on weekends. He goes out and burns and cuts and makes way for native plants in Alabama. He's obviously going to graduate school. He turned down a full scholarship to Cornell when he was still a high school student, wanting to stay closer to home with his family. But Noah's going places. He'll be somebody on everybody's radar. In fact, most of the rock stars of botany in the South already know about Noah and have tried to hire him. He also keeps an eye out for discussions of seeds on Facebook and other sites where carnivorous plant enthusiasts tend to post messages and share information. And so he's trying to hunt poachers online. I asked him how it was in college and what it was like with his fellow students. He was the only botany major in his class in Auburn. And he said that he found there was a sort of chosen path of ignorance among some of his college peers who, he said, it's more than plant blindness. It was like their whole priority was shifting away from the natural world. And the students who were studying biology were just pre-med. And then there were the ag students who were worried about production and enhancing production in farming, but not so interested in the botanical basics. So he was discouraged and felt like a lot of his classmates would never be exposed to the amazing biodiversity of Alabama beyond their introductory biology class. And he obviously is an exception. So Noah was hired when he was just out of high school by the Atlanta Botanical Garden to do a census of pitcher plants in northern Alabama. And he was obviously a very diplomatic and charming representative, because at one site that he went to that had been seen earlier in 1995, he was taking this census more than 20 years later, or 15 years later, he found a patch of pitcher plants in really bad shape. And he asked their owners, it was private property, did they know anything about them? And the people looked at the pitcher plants like this and said, well, what's so special about these plants? In fact, they were worried the government might take their land because of the plants, Noah said. So he realized he needed to help them understand that wasn't going to happen and to show them just how special the plants were. Now, these are healthy green pitcher plants, and his boss, Emily Coffey, who I mentioned before, arranged to send the landowners tickets to visit the Atlanta Botanical Gardens so they could see the descendants of the pitcher plants grown from seed taken from their property. And Noah said after that, they were stunned and are now totally gung-ho about preserving the plants on their land. The green pitcher plant, the second one in this talk, was first documented in 1900, and now it grows mostly on private property across 4 Alabama counties, which means people on private property can do whatever they want with their plants. So it's not good news that they are not in public sites. There are some in mountainous spots in Georgia and North Carolina that have a single population each, and fish and wildlife officers in those states are charged with protecting the green pitcher plants. But these on Lookout Mountain, where we went, are on a site where visitors come. And originally, the green pitcher plants in Alabama were destroyed over the years by railroads and pond construction and gravel mining. These pitcher plants grow in areas where water is close to the surface of the ground. And so if you're a landowner wanting water for your cattle, you tend to dig out the wet spots, and there go the pitcher plants. Here in the park on Lookout Mountain, this is about 8 miles northeast of Fort Payne, Alabama. The CCC developed this park in the 1930s, and it's really nice with campsites and cabins and hiking trails. And they supply hikers with a list of rare plants, and the delicate pink lady slipper, which is Alabama's largest native orchid, can be found in the woods here. The brochure says, take only pictures, leave only footprints, kill only time. But as it turned out, we didn't need to ask where the pitcher plants were, because we saw this wonderful display that was created by a Boy Scout working on his Eagle designation. They wouldn't tell us where they were in the woods when we asked at the visitor center, because just a few months before, a teacher and her students had come to visit and take a hike and see the green pitcher plants in the wild. And 2 weeks later, all those plants were gone. So again, lending credence to this poaching problem. We stopped by the Davis Arboretum a couple of times in February and in May to visit with Noah and to meet his boss, Patrick Thompson, at the Arboretum. And they have a great collection of rare and endangered plants and a demonstration site for several varieties of pitcher plants. So we got to see a bunch of different beautiful kinds of pitcher plants. Patrick said that he tends to be a hoarder and that this is a safe place for him to collect things. So he's glad he has this job at the Arboretum. He also cares for bonsai plants at home, and he tortures plants, he says, in the Japanese tradition. Here are Patrick and Noah with 2 trays of pitcher plants that have been cultivated there at their demonstration site. And Noah said there are more Sarracenia or Oreophila here in this tray than still exist in the wild at the site they are from. So for the species as a whole, only 6,000 individuals of this plant remain. An entire species represented only by 6,000 plants left in the wild. And this is John Evans, who is a wizard at cultivating pitcher plants in a greenhouse. And if you think about it, pitcher plants eat insects. And when they're in a greenhouse, they can't reliably feed on insects. And given that they prefer nutrient poor soil, it's not like you can fertilize them into health. So John has figured out, and this was just the most amazing greenhouse full of pitcher plants, totally gorgeous. And his boss, Emily Coffey, was also showing us around the tiny flutes of the baby pitchers under grow lights. Now, Emily is a hero. She's training the next generation of plant conservationists like undergraduates and graduates that they can find in the South and beyond. She's also led an effort at Atlanta Botanical Garden to enhance the representation of women and people of color and low-income students through paid internships with the garden, no using student labor for free. And with grant funding, the garden in Atlanta has also been able to offer memberships to a broader range of people, different income groups in the city, and to kind of make a dent in the dominance of Euro-Americans in the environmental field. Atlanta Botanical Garden was founded when I was a kid, I think, by a group of nice white ladies who belonged to an exclusive garden club on the north side of town. But things have changed in Atlanta, and Atlanta Botanical Garden is really reaching across the region to work in many, many sites with plant conservation. I was very proud to get to know them. And then one more kind of comment here. So the legislation for Ever Wild, Alabama is significant. And one of the findings from this book was that the feds are not always the best people to protect plants. States and even municipalities are doing it with legislation and with laws and prohibitions. So in 1992, Alabama had the least amount of public land set aside for conservation and wildlife in the South. And they had no programs or plan to expand parks or nature preserves or wildlife areas. And then a group of citizens came up with Amendment 543 to the Alabama Constitution, Forever Wild Alabama. And it got the highest vote among bills passed in 1992. And then it was approved later by the citizens, 84% of the citizens, Alabama voters, in a public referendum. So that by 2019, there were more than 266,000 acres that had been acquired since the public approved that referendum. But this is a great story. So the state invited 33 citizens from different organizations and businesses to come up with the outline of a conservation plan. And this group of 33 met around the state in various natural sites early in the morning, once or twice a month. But at the first meeting, the facilitator asked everyone to list their hopes on one sheet of paper and their fears about the process of doing this on a second sheet of paper. And then the facilitator asked them to read their lists aloud. And as one person said, we sat and looked at each other. We had a common bond, the same hopes and fears, and that made us begin to see each other as people other than an organizational representative and thus the enemy. And they were able to cobble together Forever Alabama. So Chuck Byrd said, the older generation already had a strong land ethic. Younger folks weren't taught this stuff in school, but many of them have become self-taught like Noah, which means they have a drive to learn. And there's better means for connectivity among those of us who share an enthusiasm for plants through the internet. And of course, like in Alabama, North Carolina has a history of hunting and fishing, and people pick up on that. So people have really wanted to help the conservation effort in Alabama. And Chuck said, the longer I live here, the more hope I have. So I think fundamentally, almost in all 12 stories in this book, there is a note of hope and a lot of very serious issues that need to be addressed. And I just wanted to show you my compadre, Donna Campbell, taking a picture of the demonstration site there in Auburn. So took you to a different part of the country that's dealing with some of the same issues that the eastern part of North Carolina is dealing with. So I've opened things to questions if I can figure out how to stop my screen share here. Okay.
Very good. Thank you so much, Georgann. That was really, really wonderful. If anyone has questions, feel free to raise your hand if you have that functionality, and I can see if we can unmute you. Also, we have a chat box, which you should be able to access if you move your cursor on your screen. You'll see the little chat balloon at the bottom of the screen. You can click that and type your question in the box to Georgann. So I hope that you will do that. This is so wonderful. We're getting comments like this was really very wonderful. One question to you, Georgann, as we wait for questions to come in, and this is always so fascinating to me. We have this problem in Carolina Beach State Park as well, that people will poach the pitcher plants that grow in the wild, that they could very easily just go to Hobby Lobby and buy for, $2.99, $3.99. And I kind of wonder sometimes, like, how do we get people to value the plants that exist in the wild while devaluing the desire to collect them, and somehow make them more accessible? It just seems so strange to me.
Yeah, it does. And I guess, living, my cabin in the mountains is very close to the Blue Ridge Parkway. And one of the sustaining things in my life is driving on the parkway. I guess I'm going to have to get an electric something. But it's sort of I take it as serious law that I'm not going to jump out and dig up that, Oconee bell that I can see up on the rock or whatever. You're just not going to do that. And, there's some plants like Gray's lily, which grows on Roan Mountain, that all humans have to do is touch it and it will get a fungus.
Right.
And so I don't know, now that things are getting scarcer and yet you can buy them. It's kind of like my book about North Carolina foods. I picked foods that were ephemeral, that you can't get all the time, like figs, that you can't get a great cantaloupe 12 months out of the year like you can in July in North Carolina. And I love that ephemeral quality. We have to appreciate the ephemeral and understand that so are we.
We are. Let me scroll down a little bit.
There's some interesting questions.
A couple questions coming in. You can probably see them as well. Janet is asking, did you find that the general enthusiasm for native plants was greater in some states than others?
Well, I'd be hard pressed to answer that question because the people I talked to were enthusiasts pretty much exclusively. In fact, it's interesting. So river cane is in the book, and river cane is not endangered, but there's only 2% of the river cane that used to be everywhere across the South. It's a bamboo. It's a native bamboo. People see it and they think, oh, that poor fool planted Asian bamboo, and now look what a wall they've got. Well, people loved river cane and used it. And I met this guy on the side of the road in Georgia, and he was out chopping river cane, and he was a local preacher. And I said, is this legal? And he said, well, yeah, I'd come down here every year and I use these to stake my tomatoes. And, and indeed, that was a very healthy stand of river cane, not endangered, no prohibition from it, but he could stake a lot of tomatoes from what he was chopping. So there was evidence of people and their enthusiasm, kind of like my grandparents were enthusiastic for native plants. But I don't know. I think the scarcer they get, maybe the more enthusiasm there'll be. That's a sad comment, but true.
Brian is asking, does suspected insect decline affect carnivorous plants?
I wonder if that's Brian, my friend in Southern Pines.
Brian O'Grady.
Yeah, could be. I don't know. I would expect that would be a problem. And of course, in the book, as you mentioned earlier to me, Virginia, there is there is a very particular kind of mosquito that loves, that actually breeds inside a pitcher plant and has figured out how to do that without being eaten.
Right.
So the pitcher plants are not just eating insects, but they are also housing some that have figured out how to survive. So that's another important gift from the species.
Okay. Shirley is asking, is there a penalty in North Carolina for stealing plants from public areas?
Yes, and that's discussed at length in the chapter, and I can't quote it to you, but it's a very stiff penalty. And if you've read the Wilmington paper in the last 10 years, there have been some people. There was one fellow who was caught, I think twice, poaching carnivorous plants, and he had a case for every plant he took.
Right.
And it was very possible that he was going to go to prison for the rest of his life, which seems a little.
I know that's true for Venus flytraps.
Yeah.
I'm actually not sure about.
There were pitcher plants stolen from Orton Plantation and from Holly. What's it called?
Holly Shelter.
Holly Shelter.
For game lands.
Yeah, you can Google it and read some of these stories. And unfortunately, it really is people who have little income and little opportunity to make a living who are doing this. And so it's a very unfortunate circumstance.
Okay. Shirley's also asking, do you think the trend for foraging in wild areas, like going out to find ramps, contributes to people's carelessness about taking wild plants in general?
Well, you know, with mushrooms, you got to know what you're doing. And there's a retreat center that I go to in the mountains of North Carolina, and every year the National Mycological Society gathers for a week, and they usually find 300 to 400 varieties of mushrooms on this.
Oh my goodness.
On 1,200 acres up there.
Really?
And they bring them back to the dining hall and cook them, and then invite the other groups who are there to dare to eat them. I think foragers generally are pretty serious about, you've got to overcome your plant blindness to be able to forage. You know, you've got to learn your plants. So I think that's probably a positive thing. Unfortunately, with the ramps, what people are doing is just pulling them up by the roots and not cutting them off at the ground level. And so the Cherokee have been trying to educate people about that. And whenever I'm in the mountains in April and I find a place that has ramps and the roots are on them, I bring them home and plant them. And I have a very nice ramp patch now.
I'll bet you do.
And they're great with eggs.
Brittany is saying, she's made a comment that moths can also hide in the pitcher plants. Made a little smiley face, and she's also talking about there's a huge issue with deforestation from construction for homes. I don't know if that's something you'd like to comment on further. I know that you referenced the moth in your book. Yeah,
there's a woman who actually did that census with Noah Yawn, and she had found the moths, and I think done her dissertation on the moths, and then went back with Noah, and they were not present. Where she had found them years before. So so much sadness and loss, but there's also a lot of energy among, especially these young folks from Atlanta Botanical Garden, who go out in teams all over the place. And but hurricanes have caused damage. You know, in Florida, this tree that's chapter 2 was almost wiped out by Hurricane Michael. So
right. Julie Moore, who you may know from Venus Flytrap Champions, and if you don't, I'll make an introduction. She's quite wonderful. She has commented that state laws only protect certain listed species, unfortunately. I think in reference to that earlier question about where plants might be able to be collected. Brittany Harry has commented, it's also important to include Indigenous people in North Carolina for river cane et al., but programs are not very strong here. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, actually, there is a program in the mountains of North Carolina called RT CAR, which is restoring the cane. I can't remember what it stands for, but it's an acronym, and it's a collaboration, a coalition among Native people and white folks and others who want to help restore river cane precisely for the Native American artisans who make baskets.
Okay.
The Cherokee have an agreement with in Kentucky with I think it's Berea. I want to say anyway. They can't find good cane in North Carolina, and so they're now starting to do outplantings of cane precisely for the tribe to have what they need to make. And there's a group in Alabama, a tribe in Alabama down near Mobile that's doing the same.
Oh, that's really interesting. Thank you. Dana is commenting that they've been selling pitcher plants at her local Ingalls in Western North Carolina. And she's wondering now how we'd know if they came from seed or more nefarious methods. Any thoughts?
I would imagine that Ingalls would buy from a wholesale nursery that was in the business of cultivating them. There's one in Supply. Do you know that nursery in Supply, North Carolina, Virginia, that does carnivorous plants? They got robbed, I think, at one point.
I know that. I can't be trusted to be put on the spot like this and come up with a name. It will come up. It will come to me.
Yeah, I think it would be awfully hard to sell carnivorous plants in quantity that weren't cultivated.
Right. I don't know if Shelton Herb Farms sells any carnivores or not. I've always heard that if you're buying carnivores and they have all the other species around them, you should be suspicious that they have been just wholesale poached. Jack Sproul is asking if you are aware of any subterranean synergies between plants you've studied and other plants in the wild. I'm assuming like fungi.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the last plant in the book is a parasitic plant. And it's also a bellwether plant that suggests the presence of, at one time, a prairie. And we don't tend to think about having prairies in the South, but we did. And the plant is American chaff seed, and it grows in South Carolina and is being outplanted in South Carolina. And it grows where quail like to live. And so it tends to be also a plant that quail enthusiasts are trying to help propagate, but it does depend on another host plant to thrive. And so there's research being done about what kind of host, and it's an even harder plant to restore to the wild.
Okay. A couple of people are commenting about wanting to learn more about the cane, wish more people would use it in gardens. Somebody was, I think the North Carolina Wildlife Federation was suggesting there's a place called the Flytrap Farm. Is that the place you're thinking?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay, so that could be it. Somebody in Cherokee, North Carolina would like to learn, or in Moore County would like to learn more about the programs that you're referencing.
Well, so there is the North Carolina Extension office in Cherokee, in that county, which is the extension agent there is the only guy that works for a sovereign nation instead of a county.
Okay,
and they're very active in conservation, and both in ramp preservation, in cane cultivation. So if you're ever up that way, go to the extension office and meet the folks. They might even give you some ramp seeds.
That's fantastic. I don't see any more questions coming in the chat, but we have a few minutes, and I just keep coming back to how can we how can we work toward education in a way that that doesn't create this desire to pick the flowers, if you will, out of the wild, but to leave them there?
You know, when I was a kid and we went to the symphony, they taught us when to clap,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Mm-hmm.
and when we went to other things and learned how to behave properly. And I don't mean to sound like the old person I have become, but but I think taking kids to botanical gardens and showing them some of these plants that might not be with us for long, or taking them to a conservation site
Mm-hmm.
that may, you know, there are incredible conservation sites in North Carolina, and some of them are only open one day a year. Again, it's that ephemeral thing that you can only go one day. Take a kid and show them what's coming up and teach them not to touch, teach them to, you know, enjoy, but not to destroy. And why not, right?
I wonder.
That's one of the things I encourage in the book, is
Yeah.
really taking kids to see these treasures before they're gone.
Right. I also kind of wonder, is it Noah, the young man who you mentioned? I mean, it would be so wonderful to be a kid and to have lessons in how to cultivate these things, you know, how to grow them, because I think as you understand the process, and how these species survive and what they need, not just by themselves, but in terms of an entire plant community, suddenly the appreciation becomes more as well.
Somebody was asking about the cane. So there are 3 species of cane in North Carolina: Arundinaria gigantea, which is the big cane; Arundinaria appalachiana, which is a deciduous cane that grows in the mountains on ridge tops, and that Alan Weekly of the North Carolina Botanical Garden helped distinguish and name. And then there's Arundinaria tecta, which is what you find in eastern North Carolina, which the indigenous people used to make mats, and they would wrap, like, people who died in these mats to bury them. So we had a rich cane history.
That's great. Brian is asking, do you have any comments on the relationship between plant conservation efforts and attempts to get Duke Energy to move away from burning carbon, for example, to get utilities to recognize the true cost of burning coal and even natural gas?
Yeah, I think that, gosh, Brian, it seems like people are just going to be motivated by money, but, you know, they took a stiff hit with the coal ash remediation project down around Charlotte with the Catawba River, which was the most degraded river in the country in 2006. And there's a chapter on the Shoals spider lily in the book, which is a gorgeous event between Mother's Day and Father's Day that happens every year, unless Duke Energy has let too much water out of the dam upstream and the lilies are underwater. I think we just have to keep telling these stories about the fabulous things that exist along these rivers that they have impounded and put in danger. And, you know, like I said, I'm going to have to get something electric to ride around before long.
Okay. Hope Myers is asking, how long does it take river cane to biodegrade? Do you think it would serve as a sustainable alternative to plastics for bowls, containers, storage?
Interesting. I actually asked that of a Clemson, a guy in the Clemson agriculture program. I said, why aren't we planting this and harvesting it and making exactly these kind of products? And he said, well, who would we sell them to? And we also had an interesting discussion about glyphosate and other things. So we were not totally of a mind, but the first and natural use for river cane is as a flood mitigator and as a carbon sink. And we used to have so much of it that there were parts of the state that were impassable. You had to go around the River Cane to travel. So I think it is a sustainable alternative, but the Asian folks who have bamboo have done that, and we haven't. We don't know about whether there'll be a market, apparently.
Right. This is interesting. And she also comments there's a movement toward more sustainable, eco-friendly. I'm losing my thread here. Karen Sorensen's asking, does Phragmites push out river cane?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know, but I'm afraid it might. I did not address Phragmites in the book. What they were worried about along the Cahaba River, south of Birmingham, were the elephant ear plants that people grow in pots and then put the bulbs out at the street for the trash guys to pick up when their plants don't look pretty anymore, and the bulbs go down into the sewer system and end up in the Cahaba River. And now that is an invasive along the shores. But I would imagine Phragmites could be just as harsh.
We certainly have plenty of it around here, as we do elephant ears in the Cape Fear region. Brittany is, I think she wants to send you some trillium images that she took in Cherokee. Nancy is commenting that there is a disease affecting cane
in Louisiana.
Louisiana right now. Does anyone else have any questions? We have about 3 minutes left. Deborah is commenting, it seems as if a lot of times the way to change the actions of poachers, communities, or governments that imperil endangered wildlife, butterflies, and plants is to empower those who are the bad guys to be the protectors instead.
That's an interesting idea. Hire them as rangers in the green swamp.
I love that. Let's see. Sorry, I have a tiny little box that keeps shifting here. Everybody's looking forward to reading your book. Brittany says there's a lot of damage being done to the Chinese-Japanese knotweed in many areas, and wants businesses to also be educated. So fingers crossed with more public and community action and outreach. Juliana is saying, as a young Native person from Cherokee, is there any ways that she can get involved in protecting our resources?
Well, Juliana, I don't know where you are, if you're in the Wilmington area or where, but there is a young man in the Catawba Nation who's working to restore both the language and the food sovereignty of his tribe. And that involves one of the plants in my book that at one time was a food source to the Catawba Indians. I think, finding Native persons in the area other Native persons who are interested. And of course, if you're down east, that's a long way from Cherokee. It might be worth talking to the Indian Affairs folks in Raleigh and see if they have a list of people who are involved in environmental issues, because it is true that our historically indigenous folks are still working this issue very well and have a lot of wisdom to offer we who tore things up pretty good.
Yeah, she says she's currently a student at NC State, but has many connections to Cherokee.
Okay. The Agricultural Extension Office could point you.
Okay. We will. I will look into that as well, Juliana. So if you send us your contact information.
There's definitely synergy between NC State and the Extension Office, obviously, because that's sort of where it all started.
Terrific. Hope is asking if wild ramps are rare in North Carolina.
Well, they're not endangered. They're not officially endangered, but they are certainly being pulled up wholesale almost like somebody snatched the hair off the land. And so people are, you know, there is great secrecy around where ginseng grows, and it's more and more secrecy around where people have ramp patches. But I don't think anybody's done a census as far as I know.
Okay. Well, this has been terrific. We are at 1 o'clock, I think. I have one more comment from Julie Moore, who I'll connect you with, Georgann. She says that the decline of cane is in part due to lack of burning, even in wetlands, historically very common natural fires on landscapes. I encourage everybody to get a copy of Georgann's wonderful book, Saving the Wild South. I have enjoyed it thoroughly. It's a wonderful book. It's a very accessible book, and I think it's going to be very, very popular. So I'm just delighted that you had time to spend with us today and to go over this this material with us. So thank you so much, and we will talk to you soon.
Glad to do it, and thanks all of you who have passion and tuned in and offered your thoughts. I learn a lot every time I talk about this, so thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, have a great day.